This original WSRE presentation is made possible by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dee Dee Sharp, and welcome to the Fall Kickoff Show for Aware, now celebrating 28 years and counting here on WSRE TV. I'm glad you're right there with me. November is right around the corner, as you know, and millions of Americans will head for the polls to vote. You're probably one of them. Well, voting is the foundation of the American democracy, and at the heart of this democracy is that all eligible citizens should have a right to a free, fair, and accessible voting process. Americans like you should believe that when you go to the polls and mark your ballot, push a button, and tap a touch screen, your vote will be accurately, securely, and fairly counted. On the first segment of the Aware Show, we're going to discuss voting rights and examine factors that impact, limit, restrict, or serve as barriers to voting. We'll also discuss what advocacy groups are doing to protect the vote and ensure a fair and accurate voting process for all. On the second segment of our show, we're going to take a look at some of the amendments and referendums that will appear on the Florida ballot. We'll have a lot to discuss, so we want to get started right now. Joining me here in the studio for the first segment of our show is none other than the Honorable Jewel Cannada-Wynn. Ms. Wynn serves on the Pensacola City Council and represents District 7. Next is this lovely face, Ms. Charlyle Parrish, Chair of Voter Services for the League of Women Voters, Pensacola Bay Area. Also, Dr. Paula Montgomery, Chair of the League of Women Voters, Juvenile Justice Committee. And last but not least, and certainly a familiar face here on the Aware Show, we have Carol Mcintosh, President, Progressive Black Women's Coalition. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Aware Show. We're so glad to have you. As I mentioned, we've got a lot of ground to cover and a short time to do it. Time just ticks away as we go. I want to get started here with a little history of voting and that sort of thing, particularly with voting rights. And Carol, you're our guru for that, so we're going to go straight to you.
Well, I really want to talk about the 100 years, starting with 1865. I think we need to kind of get an understanding, get that base there. So in 1865, before 1865, we have to realize that only white men voted. And then after 1865, we had the abolishment of slavery. And with that, and I'm just going to say this quickly because the time is short, and then 3 years later, we had in 1868 the 14th Amendment, which was equal protection under law. And then if you look at the timeline, 2 years later, in 1870, we had the 15th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment allowed black men only to vote. And so women, we could not vote at all. That's black women, white women, any type of woman. It took another 50 years. What did I say? 50 years for black women and women, period, to vote.
Right.
And then, and that brought on the 19th Amendment. And then another 37 years for the Civil Rights Act to come into effect, and another 8 years for the Voting Rights Act. If you add all of that, it's about 100 years. And so what we're talking about and what we're going to talk about tonight is something that's been going on for a long time. And also, and they can jump in here, because when we go back to the 15th Amendment, when black men began to vote, then I think like with anything else, when you have the pie and you have the whole pie, and now there's someone else that can come and change the outcome and want a little piece of the pie, then you had your disenfranchisements and your problems with them trying to kind of put down the vote or kind of make the vote not as important. Suppress the vote.
It's about power. It's about power. Who's going to ensure? Who's going to make the policy decisions for our city, our county, our state, and our nation? And so the voter suppression, it was about that power. I can reach this. You can't say, looking at it, it was about who felt themselves better or superior, but it was about the power. For women, our right to vote has been phenomenal. We recently have gone out in large numbers, and women now looking to run for office more. They're getting more confidence in running for office. But when you look at some time of the way in which districts are drawn, okay, gerrymandering sometimes impacts the way in which we vote and discourages the vote. Also, in your neighborhoods, as an elected official, I would be looking at to make sure that in my neighborhood that there's a place to go and vote, a polling place, because if you want to discourage people from voting, saying, you know, maybe they have to go a long way to vote. Sometimes people don't have transportation, and so our community has kind of embraced getting you to the polls. But it's important that our supervisor of election, our elected officials, make sure that polling places are a good place. Education, I'm also an educator, so educating an important block for me, the 18 to 25 years, that young group that sometimes don't want to go out. They are our future, and being a part of the political process is very, very, very important.
And so we're going to be talking about all of those things. And so I'm really glad that you kind of potpourried that for us to just kind of lay it all out there and know all the colors that are going to come out here on this program here on The Aware Show, Jewel. We really appreciate that. And speaking of education, just turning briefly back to you, because we know the League of Women Voters, that's what you all are all about. But Carol, I want to get back to you talking about education, because people need to understand that with the vote, and any of you can jump in too, by the way, but going back to what you're talking about, some of the history there, thank you for sharing, the voting rights of 1965. It's important for us to go back to that point, because a lot of things are going to start happening as well when that starts to being unraveled in recent years. So can we just go right back to that?
Right, and the Voting Rights in 1965, now you know, that was a part of Martin Luther King and the Selma March. I think, you know, I don't know about anyone else, but I go there every year to Selma, and that is a part, you know, that of the Civil Rights Voting Act. But it was a part of making everybody a part of the process. And what they took out was Section 5 of the Civil Rights Act, which was very, very important.
And we say we're talking about in 2013, and I see that we can ready.
Yeah, go ahead.
Charlyle was about to jump in there.
Go
I was
ahead.
going to let her take over. You or Paula at any time.
Talk about that.
So in 2013, we know that the Supreme Court ruled to take out sections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and this has kind of sort of impacted the way things are being done now. And those sections had to deal in particularly with things that what you're talking about right now have to do with some of why people are saying that we ended up with some of the voter suppression issues that have come about.
Well, Section 5 kind of, before they made any changes, before they did anything in regards to voting, they had to kind of get it approved or looked over, evaluated before they could do it. But when they took Section 5 out, and you come on in, Paula, when they took Section 5 out, what they did was they took that regulation out. So that's when we started getting all of the different disenfranchisement regarding to voting that we got. I want to talk about briefly, and I'm going to let Paula get in, but I want to talk about the direct disenfranchisement and also indirect, because it's going to go right into the gerrymandering. When you have direct disenfranchisement, you have the violence that happened at the very beginning. You have the violence, you have fraud, you have felony convictions. All of this is going on right now. You have voter ID laws, automatic voter purges, and restrictive registration policies. All those things we have to look at. And direct is when you actually prevent people from voting. That's direct. Indirect is when you try to impact the vote itself, the power of the vote. And indirect is gerrymandering. We're going to talk about that as well. Ballot box stuffing, stripping elected officials of their powers, and literacy tests. Do y'all remember? I know y'all don't remember. No one's back then, but you know they had the literacy tax and poll taxes. And what I understand, poll taxes didn't in until 1966.
Something like that.
Yes.
Yeah, after the Voting Rights
Right,
Act,
right.
they took away
1966, poll.
the literacy tests and the poll taxes and other ways in which people were just prevented from registering to vote, much less from voting. And then after they took away those things, then immediately they started looking for other ways to limit the vote of the people that would not vote. The people in power would say, I don't want them to vote, whoever they are, because they would not vote for me. So they started figuring out ways to keep certain segments of the society from voting. And one of the ways they did that was gerrymandering. Now, in gerrymandering, what you do is you redraw a district lines so that you include the people that would vote for you and you exclude the people who would not vote for you. And this can be done a number of different ways. You can either pack all the people who wouldn't vote for you in one district so that all the rest of the districts would fall to you, or you can crack them open so that you only have a few people from the ones who wouldn't vote for you in your district, so they would be the strong minority. And some other interesting things with gerrymandering is, one of them is called kidnapping. And when you kidnap, what you do is you take the incumbent that you don't like and you redraw the district so that all of a sudden they don't live in that district anymore. So they can't run for office. That's called kidnapping. And another thing that you can do is you can put the two people who are incumbents into one district. You don't like them, so you only want one of them at the most. So you put them both in one district, they have to run against each other, and this limits the number of people. All of that is different ways you can gerrymander. It's just a way of drawing the lines to so that your party can win.
But isn't there a little gerrymandering that goes on no matter what you do? You know, what the rules are? Isn't there just a little of it that goes on?
I think there's probably some good and some bad in everything. It's moderation and how you do it, and yeah. So, and I think what Paula is speaking to, when you're intentionally drawing districts and when you're intentionally gerrymandering people in and out to get your candidate elected. But yeah, I mean, there's a way that it can be done, and I know that the League of Women Voters and other advocacy groups are out there trying to keep a watchful eye out on this, so that you can kind of, how would you say, weigh and see how what's fair and what's balanced.
Right. When the legislature did draw some new lines because of the census and so forth, the league was right in there watching to see how that was done. And when they saw them drawing district lines that looked more like an eel than it did, you know, with groups of people, natural areas like separating them by a river or some geographic thing, then it became quite a problem, especially in South Florida in particular, maybe not so much here, because the thing that we were trying to do is, again, letting the people weigh in on this, but we want the districts to be contiguous, one right after, and not go down, you know, miles and miles down into the state, so we could pick up selective folks. So that's, and even though we have it and it's working well now, I think we're in a situation where without diligence, we might find the legislature trying to do it again, especially when the census comes around and we see changes in our where our folks live and so forth. So,
and I think, Jewel, maybe you can speak to this to some degree, you know, just kind of piggybacking off what we were talking about a little earlier about the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and having sections of it taken out by the Supreme Court, and looking in particularly, I think something that's very interesting before I have you comment here is that how the justices decided back in 2013 and how this impacted elections going forward. Justice Antonin Scalia said the law was merely a racial entitlement. Then we had Chief Justice John Roberts said the opinion's author and the coverage formula made sense at the time that it was adopted, which would have been 1965, so he felt like it was outdated. And then we had a complete dissent on the vote by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who wrote, throwing out the pre-clearance, which is what you were talking about, when it has worked and continued to work, to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. And so the result of throwing something that was so important that kept particular states who were, what they were doing were, they were actually engaging in these type, not gerrymandering, so to speak, but different activities that spoke to suppressing votes. And so what the Voting Rights Act did was it stopped them from doing it and forced them into a pre-clearance where they would have to speak up front about what they were going to do before they did it, to make sure it wasn't, it was like transparency, so that they would make sure that they were not discriminating against particularly anyone really that would have their civil right taken away from them, the right to vote. And so it was one of the hugest federal legislations for the government to have put in place to protect voters' rights. So in Shelby versus Holder, it actually took it away when the justices decided that they were going to go forward and take these measures away. And so you've seen an influx of states coming in now and began to do certain things, and that's where I'm trying to lead to you, Jewel. You may not go specifically as to what Florida may or may not be doing or what we may or may, but what I'm leading to is this is where some of this voter suppression is coming in at, because states are able to slide in and slip in and do things that can sway and take a person's right to vote away from them. And some of those mechanisms we've talked about has actually spoken to, we were speaking about it earlier.
Yeah, there are a lot of different ways in which the states have passed laws that disenfranchises whole groups.
Purging was where I was going, and I was going to be quiet and let you go there, thinking you were reading my mind, but yeah, I want to talk about purging.
Okay, there are different ways that purging goes on. One of them is sort of secret. You don't know that you've been purged until you try to vote. That happened in New York State not too terribly long ago. There are other ways. I think it was...
When we say purging, what are we talking about?
Oh, we're taking them off the voter rolls.
Who?
The people in power. The people in power.
Taking voters off the rolls, and they don't know.
And they don't even know.
Until they go to vote.
That's right. That's one way. Another way is, in fact, this has been done both by supervisors of elections and also the Republican National Committee. What they do is they look at who has voted recently and who has not voted recently, and they send out fake sort of letters that say, we understand that you have not voted recently, and if the letters come back unanswered and unopened, then those people are put on a list for purging.
It's called voter caging.
Yeah, caging. That's one way of doing caging, and that would be sending out these letters. And another way of getting them off the rolls would be...
it could be the names, similar names. Say, for instance, Paula Montgomery and so on. You know, a lot of people have Paula E. Montgomery, Paula L. Montgomery, and it might be someone that has the same initials.
But they also, the method in which they use to purge, for example, you can use cross-sectional different types of, the phone records or other things.
That's a cross-check.
Yeah, that's a cross, and then you eliminate a person. Maybe they have the same name. You have the same name, so someone's going to get eliminated, from that. One of the things that I saw was it was a big uproar in about a couple of years ago about requiring photo IDs. So for a certain population of people who may not have photo IDs, And then the expense. I mean, I think here ours is $30, $35. But if you don't have $30, $35, then how you may not be able to vote. So then you have to make sure that you have other options. There are other alternatives, other identification markers to make sure that that person will be able to vote, whether or not they take a utility bill, whether or not they take a credit card, whether or not they take any of those types of things to ensure people voting. And when you got rid of that particular section by Supreme Court, it just allowed governments the subjectivity in which to maneuver into disenfranchising citizens from the vote.
It's very interesting. In Texas, they said you could either have a passport, or you could have a driver's license, or you could have a gun registration. And those were acceptable ways to identify yourself. So if you didn't have one of those three, if you had a student ID, that was no good. I mean, there were a lot of other things that would have been acceptable for identification purposes. They just said no. You have to have either a passport, a driver's license. And there are people who don't drive.
That's right. And we have to look at under voter fraud, that came up quite a bit, voter fraud, and it'll probably come up again during this particular election. And under voter fraud, it gives them the power to do 4 things that I saw when I was doing some research. Voter challenge, to challenge the voters. The voter challenges, and you all help me out with that, is that if you're going to vote, and I want to hinder someone's vote, I can challenge your vote and challenge you and say, let's look at Paula, let's look at Dee Dee and see. I think there's a situation there. And so we need to look at make sure that doesn't happen. Voter caging, we talked about that, where in regards to your addresses. Voter intimidation.
Yes, that's a big one.
A big one.
That really is. North Carolina is sort of the poster child for voter suppression by every means. And one of the things that they have done in North Carolina, it's the Department of Justice and also the Immigration Services have started looking very hard and calling in the Hispanic citizens and making them prove that they're actually citizens. And if you do that to a whole community of people, it makes everybody nervous, and so they don't try to vote.
Yeah. But we want our people to go vote. In the November election, everyone out there, again, if you are not registered to vote now, maybe you just moved to the city or the county or anywhere else. For us, October 9th is the day in which you can go up and to register. Now, some states you can vote, register and vote on the same day. That doesn't happen in Florida. Florida is 29 days before the election. You have to have registered to vote, and so to vote in that into that election, whichever primary or general election. So I would like to leave people with, even though we have some of these issues and they're coming back in different forms from years ago, is that we must go and vote. We must exercise that vote. Plan right now to take someone to the polls. Plan to encourage your young person, young adult to go to the polls. We have 7 and again, early voting. I remember, I think years ago we used to have 12 days or so, and it dropped down. So again, those are some things to keep you from voting. But we don't want you to not vote. We want you to go.
Okay, you took away my transition.
I'm
that's
sorry,
okay, and my clothes, but that's okay. You probably heard me reading them and practicing them, but that's okay, Jewel. We were going to say that too. You have a comment right quick, because I just wanted to mention this, that, we don't want to disenfranchise voters. I do want you to know that there is good purging. So it's not all bad. And when we say there's good purging that goes on, then you need to know that if you correctly do it, then you would be ensuring that voter rolls are just accurate and up to date. If you're doing it in a bad way, that would mean that you're trying to disenfranchise legitimate voters. Often, it comes at a time when it's close to an election, so it's pretty obvious that it's being done to manipulate votes and to ultimately determine the outcome, which is not democracy. Paula, do you have a comment? Because I want to get over here right quick and talk a little to Charlyle about what we do need to know about going to the polls and encouraging our voters to get out and vote. Go ahead.
There are so many ways that voters do get disenfranchised, and one of them is moving the polling place, cutting down on the numbers of polling places, cutting down on the number of days of early voting there are, saying that you can't have early voting on Sunday when a lot of people do go to the polls when they work a full-time job. And so if you do all of those things, you are also discouraging people from voting.
Mm-hmm. And thank you for getting back around to that, because our producer was reminding me to get back to that and make sure that we mention that there are a lot of other tactics that are used. We don't have enough time to talk about all of them, because the people who do what they do to make sure that you don't have your vote cast know what to do. So they'll keep gerrymandering and doing and fixing and doing things to make sure your vote doesn't count. So that's why Jewel stated, and I'll restate, that's why you have to make sure you exercise your responsibility and make sure your vote does count. And we know that. And I want to get to you right now, Charlyle, because you've been quiet, but also we had you here because we really wanted you to help us educate our voters on what they do need to know when they go to cast their ballots.
Okay. Well, first of all, we have 3 ways that we can vote, which makes allow more people, even those who might be confined to their home. We now have vote by mail, which means you don't have the absentee business any longer. You don't have to have an excuse that you're going to be out. So you can just request it, pick up the phone, call, and they'll put you on, and you'll get your ballot, mark it in the ease of your kitchen, and send it in. Okay. For the early voting, we both our local Escambia and Santa Rosa counties, that's the word.
Those are the places.
Yeah, those are the places. We will have early voting October 22nd through November 3rd, which includes a weekend. So people who do work will be able to, and we'll have longer hours for that. And then obviously the day of the election, where you have to go to your precinct. The neat thing about early voting is maybe you work downtown, but you live in Cantonment or whatever. You can go to the early voting place downtown, vote, because that has nothing to do with your precinct. And then, so that makes it easier. We have 12 or more voter IDs that we have. So almost everybody can show me a picture of some sort. They can show me a signature that they have on a bill or something else that they can do. So it's a combination of a picture, signature, ID works. What we can't accept is an out-of-state driver's license, right. But here's some people who are new to the state. So with those 3, everybody should be able to mark their ballots. We even have a way, so if they need assistance. Everybody is allowed, when they come to the polls, earlier on the day of, to bring one individual, family, friend, whatever, to assist them at the voting booth. I recommend that people take their sample ballot, think about it, mark it, bring it as a crutch, whatever you want to call it, and take it to the voting booth so that they can easily do it, because both counties, our ballot is going to be 17 inches long. In the primary it was 14, both sides. So don't forget, turn it over. And if there are items there that you are just not clear, or just don't maybe know the judges, then you have the right to leave it blank. We're not forcing anybody to vote for things they're not comfortable with. I mean, even somebody could vote an empty ballot, and that says to the supervisor of elections they were there, and it does keep you on the rolls to show some kind of interest.
Sure.
So that is possible. And if you goof at the day when you go, you're allowed 3 ballots. I'm sorry, but after 3, That's
Gotcha.
that's all you can.
Like a baseball game, you're out. I encourage you to take your children if you can. I know that, because I've done this, and there is nothing like them knowing that you're going in and you're making your vote count. It's very encouraging, especially speaking to that youthful audience that we're talking about. And also an important note, I know you would just piggyback this, is we understand that you can register to vote at 16, although you don't vote until you're 18. So you can do that as well.
Well, yes, and if your birthday is on election day and that's when you turn 18, like I had back in 16, then you're ready to go. So I highly encourage those high school students to register early. One note, I was at UWF this week, and one of the young people who new registrant, and she said, oh my gosh, if she had only knew more about the voting process and the government and everything. She said, but they took civics away from us.
Okay.
So the young people, were saying they need more information and that we need to be doing a better job of educating them.
All right.
So
quickly, voting dates again. Make sure. Get that.
Well, November 6th is the actual day. Early voting is October 22nd to November 3rd. And you can get that ballot sent to you in the mail. The last day of that is October 31st at 5 o'clock. If you haven't requested it by then, it may not have enough time to get to you.
And speaking of time, ladies, we're out of it. We've got another part of the show coming, but I just want to take an opportunity to thank each and every last one of you for joining us here on the show. We had a lot to talk about, a lot of ground to cover, and we had more than what we had time to do. But I certainly thank you for being here and sharing the information that you shared with us. Of course, we will be posting all of your resource information here in just a short moment. And then when we come back, we will have the second segment of the Aware Show, and it promises to be just as interesting as the first. Back after this. Welcome back. This segment will go by fast. We're going to take some time to take a look at the amendments and referendums coming up on the November ballot. And without further ado, I want to introduce you to our guests for this second segment. They include Larry Kellar, representing Save Pensacola Beach, an Escambia local effort. Next, this lady, Roz Fisher, a professor and anthropologist at the University of West Florida. Ms. Fisher is also a board member with the Institute for Women in Politics. And last but certainly not least, we have Sara Latshaw, a deputy political director for the American Civil Liberties Union of Florida, better known as the ACLU. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Aware Show. This segment. Glad to have you here. We are doing the second half of the program talking about what's coming up on the ballot. But Sara, you from the ACLU, we've got to come to you and just kind of talk a little bit about what we just got through talking about. And that is something that's people need to be very much aware of, not to just beat this thing over and over and over again, but kind of take it to the amendments at this point, talking about voter suppression and that sort of thing that goes on, we know, and the different things that go on with that concerning amendments when we put wording in there that don't quite go along with what's going on in the amendment, kind of confuses voters. But there's a lot of that sort of thing that goes on. Tell us a little bit more.
Certainly. I mean, I think you addressed it so much on the first half of the show that there are, so many different ways that votes are suppressed. And there's such a long history of it, and it continues to happen in so many different ways. And just like you said, oftentimes amendments are not straightforward, they're not misleading, and the voters don't always know exactly what they're getting when they vote for, or when they vote. And so just recently the Supreme Court struck Amendment 8 from the ballot because it was misleading voters. And so that's just another thing that we have to look out for, when you're voting, to make you have to read it and really know what the amendment means, so that you know that you're getting what you think you're getting.
Right, and we're going to be talking about Amendment 8, as well as some of the other amendments that our viewers can look forward to when they head to the polls. And before we do that, I'm going to turn over here to Larry Kellar, and I want you to talk a little bit about one of the referendums that will be up and for Escambia County concerning our beaches.
Be glad to. It's called the Preservation of Santa Rosa Island referendum. It was drafted by the Escambia County Board of Commissioners, and it really has two parts. Let me, if you don't mind me referring to my notes on this.
I absolutely do. I hope you do.
The first part refers to a June 2018 policy that the commissioners adopted that deals almost exclusively with unleased lands on the island. And when I say island, I'm talking about Pensacola Beach on the west end, Navarre Beach on the east end, and all the lands in between. That's what Santa Rosa Island is in this referendum. It also prohibits any new leases, and it also protects current conservation and preservation properties. The second part, and that's the most important part for the group that I belong to, say Pensacola Beach, it's a local nonpartisan group. We've been fighting for a couple years to get this referendum on the ballot. And the language in the second part, let me quote, Escambia County reaffirms the congressional restrictions of the 1947 deed. The reason we consider it important is the first part, the board's policy, deals just with unleased lands. This part deals with who's going to own and control the beach into the future for leased and unleased lands, so the entire island. So that's why it's real important to us. When I've spoken to other groups, and our group actually gathered over 16,000 petition signatures to try to get this on the ballot, a couple common questions kept being asked. So let me deal with those if I can.
Sure.
The first one is, and let me try to put it nicely, what the heck does language in the 1947 deed mean? If you haven't read the deed, it's really confusing. Like we were talking about in the earlier group, one of the ways that votes are suppressed by confusing people or not explaining what they are trying to vote on. So there's really a long history of why this referendum was on the ballot, but let me deal with the question about the deed first. So let's go back to January 15th, 1947, about a year and a half after World War II ended. The federal government signed a deed of all of Santa Rosa Island to Escambia County. Escambia County, like a corporation, is an entity. So what you're talking about is the citizens or residents that live in Escambia County. That means every resident of Escambia County is a stakeholder. They own a fractional interest in all of Santa Rosa Island. So it's unique in Florida that the entire barrier island, Santa Rosa Island, is owned by the public. And that's a result of the 1947 deed. The two restrictions in the deed that are referred to in the referendum, the first one is that all uses of land had to be in the public interest. The second restriction was that while that land could be leased or rented, if it was in the public interest, the land could never be conveyed, it could never be sold, it could never be given away. So to summarize, the restrictions in that deed that are referred to in the referendum means that every single use for property on the island has to be in the public interest, and the public is supposed to own the property forever. Pretty self-explanatory. So the next question I would get, well, yeah, it seems pretty clear to me we're supposed to own it forever, so why in the world do we need a referendum? Well, that's where it gets complicated, so if people please bear with me. I just want to try to get as much information to the voters as I can. Now what happened was, as we know, the development on the beach kind of increased in the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. At that point, the county commissioners started imposing taxes in addition to lease fees that the owners paid. There was, I don't know how many, dozens and dozens of court cases. So in 2014, when we had Jeff Miller as our congressman, the Escambia County Commissioners, the Santa Rosa County Commissioners voted unanimously that despite the clear wording in the deed, the restrictions in the deed, they were going to kill public ownership of the island, and they were going to give the beach away to the people that are renting it. That is, every person that lives on the beach, every business that's operated on the beach, they rent their property from the citizens of Escambia County. And it was supposed to be like that forever. But this bill was introduced in Washington by Congressman Miller. Luckily, it died. It never really went anywhere, so we thought, well, we've dodged that bullet. Unfortunately, we didn't dodge it for long, because just last year, for the second time, both the commission boards voted unanimously to kill public ownership, to give the beach away. Now we had Congressman Getz. He actually introduced the bill in the House. He actually got it passed. In July of 2017, the House passed a bill that would have totally ended public ownership of all the land on Santa Rosa Island. It was also introduced in the Senate by Senators Rubio and Nelson. And just so everybody knows the obvious, of course, not a single person in Washington lives in Escambia County. So they were taking away property that is owned by these county residents, and it was being voted on by people that don't live here. Most of them probably never even been to Pensacola Beach. So that's the really maddening part of it, is that the local citizens had no input. These votes were made, the legislation was introduced without any town halls. There was no public input on whether they wanted to keep it forever, which they were promised in the deed, or whether they wanted to give it away. So when our group found out that it had passed the House, we got really scared. So our group and quite a few of the 16,000 residents that signed our petition started bombarding Senator Nelson's office with emails, faxes, texts, phone calls, letters, and thank goodness he dropped his support for the bill. So just so everyone knows, we came within one vote of losing property that was deeded to us forever. And it had to be in the public interest forever. So that's why we're glad that there's finally, for the 71-year history of public ownership of the island, this is the first time, it may very well be the last time, that the people that own the island are actually going to get to vote and say, do you want to keep it or not? Hopefully, we'll say they do. But that's kind of the story or the history behind why this referendum is going to appear on the November 6th ballot.
So Save Our Beach would vote yes or no?
Save Pensacola Beach would vote yes. At the end of the referendum, there's a yes, I support continued public ownership. No is, I don't.
Right. But we also want to know why you would vote no.
Well,
so you're going to have to give me the con.
I'll be glad to.
You got the pro, now you want to give
in
the
fact,
con. We got to have both
this is the excuse or reason, whatever you want to call it, why the county commissioners voted as they did to end public ownership. I mentioned earlier that they started taxing the beach in the 80s and 90s. There are probably 20 different kinds of leases on the island. It's a horrible mess. So some people that may live right next door to each other, they pay different tax rates because their lease is worded differently. So obviously they're upset. A lot of the original people that leased it in the late 40s, the early 50s, when we first started getting people actually moving to the beach, they were responding to ads that were run in many states across the country that promised, if you'll come to Pensacola and build a home, live on the beach, you'll never be charged taxes. Now every business out there pays a quote lease fee. Anybody that's rented a house or apartment or something, they know what a lease fee is. Everybody pays a lease fee. Those are also all over the place. Some are small, some are large. But it was really all the tax litigation and the people that live there. The reason somebody might want to vote against that, the reason they might want to get title to property that they just leased, is because they don't feel like they're getting a fair shake on their taxes. Now, that has zero to do with the referendum, but if you're asking me why some people were in agreement with the bills that were introduced in Congress, that's the primary reason that I'm aware of. And it was brought up. There was a recent case in 2017 that made a big difference in what we're talking about, and that was the reason that they gave.
Okay. Well, thank you for giving both parts of that. That's good because we want to educate our viewers. And say, I really appreciate that. Want to turn back over here to my immediate left and talk again with Sara Latshaw and bring Roz into this conversation as well. Because speaking of referendums and what's going to be also on the ballots when our voters head to the polls is what we want you to talk a little bit about, the two of you. We will begin by showing you here on the screen some of the amendments that will be on the ballot. Sara, I know that you and Roz probably have an interest in amendment number 4, but we also want to give our viewers at least a chance to have a look-see and see what will be coming to you when you head to the polls. This is what they're going to be looking at. All right. One of the big ones here for the ACLU will be voter restoration. Tell us a little bit about that.
Certainly. So Amendment 4 will be on the ballot this November 6th, or obviously you can early vote or vote by mail, as they mentioned earlier. And this is an amendment that would restore eligibility to vote to people who've lost it because of a felony in Florida. You know, we are one of 4 states that permanently ban people from voting if they have been convicted of a felony. And so, you know, we just want to align our policies with the rest of the country, and we also want to give people a second chance. You know, when a debt is paid, it's paid, and we want people to have a voice in their community and to be able to come back and really, you know, make the important decisions that influence our government, that influence our children, like our school board members. And so the ACLU is working with a number of nonprofit organizations around the state, around the country. There are many local organizations that have been working on this for years, people on both sides of the aisle. It is, you know, we found that Floridians believe in second chances, and we hope that Florida law will reflect this after November.
Very good. And some of the other amendments that will also be on your ballot when you head to the polls going forward is here on your screen. And of course, as we kind of leave that up and give you a chance to take a look at some of those, Sara is going to kind of zoom in and focus on another issue that the ACLU is closely looking at, and we want you to tell us a little bit about that one. That's Amendment 6 again. It's the rights of crime victims, and tell us about that, and judges.
Certainly, and you'll notice several of the amendments that are listed on the screen have multi-subjects. You know, you'll see a slash between them, and those are the amendments that were put on by the Constitutional Revision Commission. They meet every 20 years, and they revise Florida's Constitution. And so this year, what they decided to do was group several similar issues into one amendment. And so one of the amendments that the ACLU opposes is Amendment 6. It's called Marsy's Law in some states. It's been passed and not passed in several states around the country for various reasons. But the one that we have here in Florida that was put on by the Constitutional Revision Commission, it purports to be an amendment that would protect the rights of victims. And I think we all agree that victims' rights should be protected. We want victims to have rights, but not at the expense of the accused. And what this does, it deletes the part of Florida's Constitution that guarantees protections for the accused as well as for victims. And so, it's also poorly drafted. It's also fairly misleading, and it even creates constitutional protections for corporations to weigh in. They could bring their high-powered lawyers to weigh in at sentencing hearings for people who are accused of small crimes like shoplifting. And so, it's one of those things, you read it and you think victims' rights, and that sounds like something that we all agree on. I think everyone agrees with that, but that's not what this does, and that's why we are opposing it.
All right, Roz, and I could have allowed you to jump in at any moment with any of this, and you can, okay?
Okay.
Okay, and if you choose not to at this point, we will just go on and take okay, you do.
Yeah, well,
chime in.
I would like to say something because each of those particular amendments have a big effect on the minority community or people of color in Florida, and they also have a big impact on families. And I think that I didn't realize even how Referendum 11 would have an impact on a wide range of people. I mean, I think people looked at, would say Save Pensacola Beach, and they think, oh, that's, for people that live on Pensacola Beach. But public use is for everybody. And it is the only way some people would ever have access to a beach. And so that's an important issue. And voting restoration, I mean, so much has been written and discussed recently about mass incarceration, that it's another form of Jim Crow. And so we have to recognize that when we consider that, the impact for people that have served their time, have come back into the community, and yet are not treated like citizens is amazing. I mean, they're expected to pay taxes. They're expected to come back into the society and work, although we make it very difficult for them to get a job. But anyway, I think we still have this way of deciding that some people are going to be punished more than once for crimes, and the unfairness of that is something that we should do about, we should do something about. So yes, I think all three of these amendments and referendums are important to people of color, to women, to families. I mean, I think the broader impact is that we need to recognize the importance of everybody voting, because our civil rights seem to be getting attacked left and right, and sometimes we don't even realize what it may cost us in the long run.
Yeah, it really does, it piggybacks so well with the conversation you had on the front end, because this is a form of voter suppression. The felon voting disenfranchisement started, right after the 15th Amendment was passed. And it is a Jim Crow era law, which is why it's so important. This is the right time to change it.
And want to also take a look going ahead here and just finishing up on the referendums that you will see at the ballot here on the screen. Just want to show you some more. Number 8, we know has been pretty much there's an issue with that. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Sara, before we go forward with the last ones?
Yes, there was some litigation related to that amendment. It was one of the amendments that was placed on by the Constitutional Revision Commission. It was it had 3 different subjects included in it, and it was reviewed by the Supreme Court, and it was deemed to be misleading to voters and taken off the ballot.
Okay, and we talked about that at the little bottom of the program when we got started again with the second segment, so I wanted to give you a chance to go back and reiterate that. And then the last few amendments that you'll see here, we want to go to here on the screen to show you again, because we can't show them enough, because we want to educate you about what you're going to be looking at, so that it won't be the first time necessarily, because you would have seen it here on the Aware Show. And so the last one that the ACLU is taking a position on will be Amendment number 11. Tell us a little bit about that. Just a few minutes here left on the show.
Sure.
This part of it.
And this one's also being reviewed by the Supreme Court, so we don't know where that will end up. But Amendment 11 allows, if there are criminal justice reforms, and this goes back to reforming the criminal justice system, that perhaps lessen a sentence. Say, for example, criminal penalties for marijuana were reduced. This would allow it to be retroactive, and right now that can't happen in Florida. So that could really be important for reducing the number of people who are incarcerated in the system.
Can I make a comment
There,
about the
I was
amendments?
just on my way to the right. You go right ahead.
I just want to say briefly one more thing about the referendum, and then I'll talk about an amendment that we haven't talked about yet. And that is, we're asking the voters to do 2 things. We don't know how many of these 13 amendments are going to make it on the ballot, but we do know that we've been told that our Save Pensacola Beach or Preservation of Santa Rosa Island will be the very last item on the ballot. So what we're asking people to do is, when you get your ballot, however long it is, or 2 sides, please go to the very bottom and vote yes to support the referendum to preserve Santa Rosa Island. The second thing we're asking you to do when you go back and vote on the candidates and other issues is please vote for a candidate that, if you support this amendment, is going to support your position and is not going to try to give away the public beach again. And I just want to briefly comment on Amendment 9.
I do want to, before you go there, I do want to say about that particular amendment, that referendum is that there are 2 sides to every story. So just want to put that out there.
As a lawyer, there's usually 4.
Okay, go ahead.
Right.
What else are you going to say about the
Amendment 9 has to do with banning offshore drilling. For people that don't know, the current administration in Washington, specifically the Department of Interior, is trying to open up vast areas off the coast of Florida to drilling. On the Atlantic side, it would be within 3 miles of the coast. On the Gulf side, it would be within 10 miles. People that lived here like I did in 2010 and remember what happened with the BP oil spill, you've got to remember the Deepwater Horizon, where that exploded and caused the oil spill, that was 115 miles from the coast of Florida. Can you imagine what damage we'd still be suffering if it had been 10 miles from the coast? So just please remember that when you go vote on Amendment 9.
Okay, very good. All right, I think we've got you up to date on what you need to know about that. Roz, I want to come to you, because one thing that we've been noticing here before we wrap up the show is the power of the vote from women. We had some legal
yes.
women voters on the first segment, but I want to come to you because that's kind of what you've been working on. That's your thing. Tell us about it.
I'm really excited
Keeping a watchful eye on that.
Yeah. I'm really excited by the number of women that are running for office around the country and the kind of support that has been shown. There was this big controversy about the fact that so many black women came out and kept Roy Moore from winning in Alabama. And white women were saying, oh, thank you, black women, for coming out and doing this. And they were saying, oh, this was, like magical, you know. But it wasn't. It was hard work. Women got out and did the door-to-door. They got people rides to the polls, and they worked together collaboratively across political lines. And that needs to happen always in all of these issues that we care about.
Absolutely, and I think just zooming out and seeing the bigger picture, I didn't mean to rush you, but we only have like a minute left, and I really want to get this thing out of here, because at the end of the day, the ACLU is one of many advocate groups that are out there and trying to make sure that our civil right to vote and other civil rights are protected. And so, Sara, just quick notes that you want to leave us here on the Aware Show.
Certainly. So, as Election Day approaches, we know that there are so many potential issues that can happen with voting, whether it's your polling place has been changed or something's fishy happening with your registration. And so there are many, many voting rights organizations that have come together to do poll watching and ensure that the election is protected. And so if there are any issues, we do hope that you'll reach out to us and let us know.
All right, and that number to call?
And there's a number that you can call. It's a hotline. It's 1-866-OUR-VOTE.
Okay, very good. Roz, quickly.
Yes.
Last
Well,
moment.
I just want to say, let's all come together and fight for issues we care about. So let's everybody vote. That's the most important thing.
Every vote counts. Larry, you get the last say.
I would agree. Every vote counts. So get out and vote. Whatever your position is on the candidates, the amendments, the referendums, please participate in our democracy and vote.
And feel the power of your one vote, because it can make a difference. Absolutely. Thank you all for being here. That's all the time we have for now. I leave you with these words. Voting is your fundamental right. As you know, voting is your voice. And if you want your voice to be heard, you have to vote. Every vote counts, as we're saying here. And if you're not registered to vote just yet, you can do it on get registered, and on Election Day, of course, you can vote and take someone with you. We want you to do that. Get involved. You can also volunteer to be a poll watcher, or you can just give some rides and get folks to the polls. There are a lot of ways, as you can see, on how you can get involved, and to do that and to get more information about it, all you have to do is contact your supervisor of elections office for more information. I'm Dee Dee Sharp, saying until the next time, stay informed and stay aware.